Okay, so I was having some technical issues, and so this is a totally different day than when that last video clip was made. But we're going to pick up right where we left off. We had just finished going over all of the information that you needed for the epidermis and dermis, and so now we're about to start talking about skin markings and coloration. So I'm going to switch to my screen share mode here, and this is right about where we left off. So when we were talking about skin markings, these are determined by those epidermal ridges and from the dermal papillae, right, that form that kind of egg crate layer within the dermis. And so those are what provide our ridges on our fingertips for our fingerprints. And of course, the little indentations all over our skin, those little, patterns, if you will, within our skin. So these are actually determined in utero. And so these markings, there we go, these markings can actually vary between even identical twins. So they are genetically determined, but if one twin is, say, like sucking their thumb and another one just kind of like floating there, the patterns will be different. So they are influenced by environmental and genetic conditions, which is kind of interesting. Here you can see that clear boundary on this diagram here, letter A. You can see that clear boundary between that epidermis and dermis. You can see the difference in the tissues, right? That darker epithelial tissue as opposed to that pink kind of splotchy dermis connective tissue. So other skin markings that we have are things like our lines of cleavage or tension lines. So these are caused by bands of collagen in the dermis. So imagine that there's this kind of underlying pattern of fibers underneath your epidermis. And so it's kind of like, imagine like a steak or a piece of chicken. You can cut it with the grain so that your steak is kind of, or rather your steak knife is like parallel and the meat kind of falls apart, right? Or you can cut it against the grain and it's a lot tougher, right? And sorry for those of you who are vegetarians, you might not be able to associate that, but that is exactly how the collagen bundles work underneath our skin. And so you can imagine for someone who's, say, like a surgeon, cutting along those lines of cleavage, cutting with the bands of collagen, that's going to make the healing process much quicker and easier and lead to less infection and less long-term sacrifice in the person's body. So those lines of cleavage are important. So if you've ever had surgery before, think about where that cut is on your body and maybe compare it to this diagram here, and you might see why the surgeons cut in the way they did. Now, if you have been injured in another way, maybe you had a deep cut because of a fall or a piece of glass or something, it's possible that that mark is not with your line of cleavage, and therefore the scar on that is going to be bigger, and maybe it took longer to heal than, say, a scar that would take place along the line of cleavage. So lines of cleavage, or tension lines as they're sometimes called, are kind of with the grain of collagen in that dense regular connective tissue area of the dermis. Of course, we can't talk about skin markings without talking about wrinkles, right? So wrinkles are the primary factor of a couple of things. One is dehydration. As we get older, our skin loses its moisture much easier because those cells that are actively dividing and growing when we're younger just stop when we get older, and they slow down. This is also going to slow down the rate of collagen replacement and repair and elastic replacement and repair. And so those fibers that once held our skin tightly against our body and allowed it to recoil just aren't being, maintained as they used to. UV exposure and cigarette smoke are the other two major contributors to the aging process and the wrinkling process. And you know this if you've ever seen someone who's been tanning a lot or is out in the sun a lot, their skin is very leathery and saggy, and same thing with someone who is a smoker versus a non-smoker. It's kind of interesting. We talked about twins a few slides ago. There's been a lot of twin studies done in those separate environmental conditions where they have the exact same genetics, but one was a smoker and one was not a smoker, and to see the difference in aging, it is phenomenal. You should try to Google it. It's really cool. Of course, there's lots of things you can try to do to prevent the aging process. Botox being one where you're actually kind of injecting a toxin into your skin to paralyze the muscles, to kind of freeze them and hold them in place, which is why people who've had Botox kind of have this kind of plasticky look about them, and it doesn't look like their face moves a whole lot. And that's because of that paralysis that occurs because of that toxin. There's fillers where they can kind of pull some fat from other pockets of the body and inject it into your lips or under your eyes or whatever to reduce the wrinkles there. And then topical creams, which are only so efficient, right? Because they have to get through the epidermis. And the whole purpose of the epidermis is to prevent things from coming through. So not very many things are going to be able to get through that layer to where they can actually be effective. And at that point, they're really only going in there to provide a temporary fix anyway. So a lot of the times, the creams that kind of appear to work, they work because they have caffeine in them or some type of stimulant that helps kind of spark your cells awake temporarily, kind of like giving them a quick sugar high and then letting them loose. Let's talk about melanin and other skin pigmentation. So we mentioned melanocytes briefly when we were talking about the different types of cells in the epidermis. And of course, melanocytes live in that stratum basal area, and they produce the pigment melanin, which is this kind of orangey, brownish, yellowish color. And its main function is to reduce the threat of UV light to our DNA. So UV light comes down into our cells. It can actually mutate our DNA. So when our skin detects that UV, it's going to activate those melanocytes, have them increase their melanin production so that our DNA can maintain its structure. So melanosomes are the special organelles within the melanocytes. So remember, the melanocytes are kind of these like hand-like looking cells. They kind of have these extensions coming off of them. And the melanocytes are little organelles that can kind of migrate up into the other layers of the skin. So the melanocyte itself kind of lives in that stratum basal, but its extensions can go up into the stratum spinosum and even into the granulosum. And so the higher up those melanosomes go in the layers, that's going to kind of dictate how dark your skin is. And so this, of course, production will occur in increased magnitude when you're exposed to UV light and based on your genetics. Every single human being has the same number of melanocytes. It's the number of melanosomes and the amount of melanin that varies between individuals. So this is showing you that kind of image of this really big cell that has all of these extensions coming off of it, can migrate up into the higher layers of your epidermis. Tanning, of course, is where you're stimulating your melanocytes to produce more melanin. There is no such thing as a healthy tan. There's no such thing as good UV light. It's all damaging to your skin. Of course, some people enjoy tanning because it kind of gives you a little mood boost. That increase of vitamin D makes you a little happier. It also helps your metabolism and things like that. But there's a kind of a tipping point where it gets to be a little more dangerous than beneficial there. Of course, sunburns are even more dangerous, and the main cause of skin cancer later in life is sunburns early in life. So young children and teenagers, I know when I was a teenager, I used to purposefully not put sunscreen on because I wanted to get burned because my burn always turned to a tan. That's not going to fare well for me in a couple of years as I'm aging, and those effects of UV light accumulate. Of course, there is a secondary function of melanin. So the secondary function of melanin is to slow the synthesis of vitamin D. And so you might say, well, why does that make sense? We need vitamin D. Well, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And so it can accumulate and kind of hang around in our fat tissues, unlike a vitamin, say like vitamin C, which you just are going to pee out because that's a water-soluble vitamin. If you have too much vitamin D, it can be toxic. So when your vitamin D levels rise, i.e. when you're in the sun a lot, melanin is going to increase in production to slow the production of vitamin D. Vitamin D helps with calcium absorption, and we're going to look at this calcium homeostasis model in our next chapter when we start looking at bones and bone physiology. And so people that live in areas with less UV light, they develop lighter skin because they need to make more vitamin D. They need that UV light in order to create the vitamin D, and vice versa for people that live in geographic areas that are closer to the equator and get more direct sunlight. So as we mentioned, it's the number of melanocytes and the amount of melanosomes that determine your skin color. Every individual has the same number of melanocytes. So let's talk about some variations in pigment. This, of course, would be things like freckles. So freckles are just small little spots where your melanocytes decided to increase their melanin production. This can be genetically determined, of course. A mole, or nevus is a technical term for a mole. This could be because of a proliferation. So in other words, you have lots of melanocytes in one particular area, which is why moles are typically raised above the skin. And then albinism is the opposite of this. Albinism is where your skin does not produce melanin at all. You still have melanocytes, but they're not producing melanin because of a genetic variation. As I mentioned, there's no such thing as a healthy tan. A lot of tanning salons will say, well, we use the UVB rays, which are better, or we use the UVA rays, which are better. None of them are good. In fact, they can both damage your DNA very, very quickly. UVA is the more damaging. So most of the tanning salons will say, this is only UVB, makes you feel a little safer, but it's really not. Let's talk about carotene and hemoglobin, other pigments that influence our skin color. Carotene is more of a yellowy orange. When you think of carotene, think of like sweet potatoes and carrots, right? That's the pigment in those vegetables that give them that pigment. And you know this if you've ever had too many carrots, or if you've been around people that eat a lot of carrots, their skin is actually orange, especially in areas of thick skin like on their palms. It is a lipid-soluble vitamin. Vitamin A is a lipid-soluble vitamin, just like vitamin D. And this is going to help bring about that yellowy color, yellow pigment into your skin. Hemoglobin, of course, is the pigment in our blood cells. It's a iron-containing pigment, and it helps carry oxygen. And so hemoglobin, i.e. blood, when it's underneath your surface and it's flowing underneath your skin surface and it's flowing freely, is going to give your skin this kind of pinkish glow. And you know this if you've ever restricted blood flow to a certain area. Maybe if you had a rubber band on your hand, or your legs were crossed, or somehow blood flow was restricted, that area turns bluish or purple, or maybe even gray. Well, that's because it's a condition called cyanosis, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the hemoglobin just is not in that area anymore because of restricted blood flow. So the blood flow to the dermal region is what gives your skin that kind of lifelike pinky glow. Erythema, this is something that happens to me a lot. If you are someone who gets a red face a lot, maybe you get embarrassed quickly, or your face just gets red when you get excited like mine does. This is caused by an increased flow of blood to your dermis. So it's your sympathetic nervous system that's kind of exciting those blood vessels and turning them on and opening them up to allow the blood flow. And so this is why when you exercise, your face gets red. This is why when you get embarrassed, your face gets red. It's just an increase in blood flow to the area. The opposite of this is pallor, right? This is when the blood flow decreases, right? This is when your skin kind of almost looks white or flushed. So this might be when you're about to faint, or when you're feeling ill. This could also be part of that fight or flight response, that kind of, oh my gosh, I just almost died. Whew. Right, or whatever, a car almost hit me. That kind of, I just saw a ghost look in your face, right? That's pallor. That's as opposed to cyanosis, which is that bluish, grayish color, which occurs usually when blood flow is restricted to an area because of cold, or sometimes it'll be because of a cardiac defect. It's a sign of a congenital heart problem. Older people, when you look at, I'm thinking of this man that I saw at the grocery store the other day. He was very gray looking. His skin was a grayish blue. And I was thinking to myself, I hope that man has a doctor's appointment soon, because that grayish bluish color tells you that blood is not getting to the area. And if you have grayish bluish color on your head, what does that say about your brain? It's probably not getting the amount of oxygen that it needs, and that can be very, very dangerous. Cyanosis occurs sometimes when you're cold. I think about little kids. I'm thinking about my own children when they hop in the pool, in June when the water's still freezing cold. They have blue lips and blue fingers. That's cyanosis to the area. Your body's kind of turning off the blood flow to that particular area. So let's switch from talking about our skin color to talking about hair, right? Our hair has color in it too. So we actually have parts of our hair that contain melanin, or not, if you're blonde like me. So hair itself is what we call an accessory structure, and it has a protective function. So it's kind of located around entrances to the body. It's there to kind of guard, you know, and protect our eyes. Our eyebrows function to kind of capture the dirt and sweat that come down off of our face, and our eyelashes, of course, catch dust and debris before they get into our eyes. We have hair in our nose, we have hair in our ears, we have hair around our genitalia. Again, it's all there to protect and support. So you might say, well, why do we have hair in our armpits? Well, that's because there's those special glands there, right? Those apocrine glands, which are associated with hair follicles, and they produce that stinky sweat. So they're more protected, which is why they're in that area. We don't have apocrine glands on our arm, you know, on the outside of our arms, for example. So the hair itself has a couple different layers, right? We have the shaft, which is what you see. This is what you cut. This is what you brush, right? That's the shaft. And then the root is everything below the surface. So two main areas, the shaft and the root. And so hair on humans, as we mentioned, is there for protection, and it's also there with sensory, for sensory purposes. So each individual hair not only has an erector pili muscle associated with it for goosebump purposes, but each individual hair is associated with a nerve ending, which is why, I mean, I'm thinking about my dog, right? The hairs on her back will stand up when she's agitated. Or think about you are, you know, maybe you're in a room by yourself and all of a sudden you feel a breeze on your arm. Woo, right? Those are those little sensory receptors that are going off telling you that there's air movement in the room. And so that's another function of hair other than just to guard entrances. So the shaft, again, is what's coming out of your scalp or out of your skin, and this is made of keratinocytes, just like your skin. So imagine you kind of bundle up the skin cells that are in your skin and kind of form them into a tube, right? And at the bottom, you have actively dividing cells, which are going to keep continually pushing up those keratinocytes, just like from the stratum basal, they get pushed up and up and up towards the stratum corneum. It's the same thing with our hair and the same thing with our nails. And so that shaft just continues to grow up and out. The root is that actively growing portion below the skin. So there's a special part of the root that has actively dividing cells. Not all of the cells of our root are actively dividing. The bulb is that end part that's rooted and literally has connective tissue connecting it and surrounding it to the surrounding dermal layers, because the hair structure itself is actually derived from the epidermis. It has the stratum basal, those dividing cells, right? So it is actually part of your epidermis, even though it goes down into your dermis area. I'm going to stop here because this is where the next video picks up. Have a good day, guys. Let me stop sharing. Okay, bye-bye.